Picture this, it's late 1778, and the British Army is in a bind. After getting whacked up north, they think, hey, why don't we try our luck in the south? So they roll into Georgia, hoping to win the support of loyalists, rally enslaved people to their side, and finally put a lid on this pesky American rebellion. But spoiler alert, things don't exactly go as planned. By late 1778, the British strategy was on the ropes. The campaigns up north, like the one at Saratoga, hadn't exactly ended with parades back in London. The American forces, despite being outnumbered and outsupplied, were resilient. General George Washington and his scrappy Continental Army were turning out to be way tougher than the British commanders had expected. So, British High Command in London decided to shift strategies. The thinking was simple. If they could swoop into the southern colonies, which were believed to have a higher number of loyalists, they could ignite a loyalist uprising, restore British control, and pacify the southern states one by one. By then, they figured, the northern colonies would come around too, and this whole revolution business would be done and dusted. Enter Savannah, Georgia. The British knew that this coastal city was a strategic entry point to the American South. In December 1778, British forces led by Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell were dispatched to capture it. Campbell, a smart but cautious commander, knew he had to make a big impression to set the tone for this southern campaign. His army arrived with the force of nearly 3,500 troops, a hefty invasion force by any standard at the time. Now, to paint the picture, Campbell wasn't your average British officer. He actually had some experience fighting in America and had a reputation for being clever and tactical. Instead of just charging into Savannah guns blazing, he took a more strategic approach. Campbell used scouts to gather intel on American defenses, and even managed to bribe a local slave for insider knowledge on the layout of the American defenses. With this intel, Campbell executed a textbook assault on December 29, 1778. The American defenders, led by General Robert Howe, had fortified Savannah, but they weren't expecting the British to have such precise information on their positions. In a swift attack, Campbell's forces overwhelmed the defenders. Howe's men, vastly outnumbered, fought as hard as they could, but were forced to retreat. Savannah fell to the British, and the southern campaign kicked off with a British victory. But while Savannah was now in British hands, Georgia wasn't completely under British control. The Americans might have lost the city, but the countryside was a different story. Patriot forces, as well as local militia, were not just going to sit around and let the British stomp around in their backyards. They began launching guerrilla-style attacks on British patrols, ambushing supply lines, and keeping the British on edge. The decision to start in Georgia wasn't random. British strategists believed the South held a large population of loyalists, especially in places like Georgia and South Carolina. They thought these loyalists would jump at the chance to take up arms for the crown. On top of that, the British figured they could destabilize the American economy by targeting the South, which was rich in cash crops like cotton and rice. And then there was the issue of the enslaved population. The British thought they could use slavery to their advantage, promising freedom to enslaved people who would escape to British lines and join the fight. This wasn't just propaganda, it was a genuine offer. Many enslaved African Americans did join the British, seeking freedom from a brutal system. But, ironically, the tactic only served to harden the resistance among Southern patriots, many of whom were plantation owners. As British forces entrenched themselves in Georgia, they quickly learned that this Southern campaign wasn't going to be a walk in the park. Instead of a unified loyalist uprising, they found themselves caught in the middle of a brutal civil war. Georgia and South Carolina had a mix of fiercely loyal loyalists and die-hard patriots, and they were ready to go to war with each other. Fights broke out between loyalist militias and patriot forces in the countryside. These weren't just regular skirmishes. They were often brutal, personal battles. Families were torn apart, and communities were divided. This wasn't just about allegiance to Britain or America. It was about neighbor fighting neighbor, old grudges resurfacing, and sometimes plain old survival. The Continental Congress wasn't going to let the British sweep through the South uncontested. They sent General Benjamin Lincoln to take command of the Southern forces and mount a counteroffensive. Lincoln, a determined and respected leader, began rallying Patriot forces to push back against the British advance. But it wasn't just organized military units fighting the British. The people of Georgia, especially the frontiersmen and local militias, took it upon themselves to resist. They launched guerrilla attacks, struck British patrols, and harassed supply lines, making life miserable for the occupying forces. The British may have captured Savannah, but they would soon realize that holding it was another matter entirely. As 1778 rolled into 1779, the French entered the picture. French forces, allied with the Americans, joined in a grand plan to retake Savannah. The resulting siege of Savannah, which took place in October 1779, was one of the war's bloodiest battles and a defining moment in the Southern campaign. The siege, however, was a disaster for the Americans and French. Despite a valiant assault, they were repelled by British forces. Savannah remained under British control, but it came at a heavy cost. The British strategy of a Southern campaign was proving to be more challenging than anticipated. The British Southern campaign would drag on for years, moving from Georgia into the Carolinas, where it would culminate in the pivotal battles of Camden Cowpens and, finally, Yorktown. The campaign was marked by brutality, shifting allegiances, and a fierce resistance from American patriots who refused to back down. And what about Georgia? While the British held Savannah, they never truly controlled the state. The American forces, local militias, and even the French would continue to chip away at British positions, and by 1782, Savannah would be back in American hands. The British Southern campaign had started with high hopes and a sense of confidence. But the resistance they encountered, the complicated loyalties of Southern colonists, and the relentless guerrilla warfare proved that this was a fight they hadn't fully prepared for. And in the end, the British would find that their Southern strategy only led to greater losses, and eventually to their final defeat in the American Revolutionary War. So there you have it. The British Southern campaign in Georgia was a bold, risky move, but it was met with fierce American resistance, unpredictable local loyalties, and a relentless guerrilla war that wore down British forces. This campaign was supposed to be a decisive shift for Britain, but it only deepened the resolve of American patriots and set the stage for the ultimate British defeat in the war. In short, what started as a calculated strike ended as a costly and bitter chapter in Britain's fight to retain control over the colonies.